It took just 9 seconds, one laugh. That's all it took for Megyn Kelly, seasoned host, sharp-tongued, fearless, to spark a moment that would shake the air in a studio packed with over 300 people. The cameras caught everything: a smirk, a scoff, and then a silence so deep it felt like the nation stopped breathing. She laughed at his past, not knowing that Vance, a sitting U.S. senator, had walked through fire to get where he stood. She thought she was in control, but what he said next, calm, cutting, unforgettable, turned the room upside down. This is not just a story about politics. It's about pride, pain, and the invisible line between respect and humiliation. Now, before we begin, a quick note. What you're about to witness is a dramatized reconstruction, inspired by real personalities and public tensions. The dialogue and moments have been fictionalized, but the emotions they uncover, those are real, because sometimes a made-up story tells the truth louder than the headlines ever could. So sit tight, ask yourself, what would you say if someone laughed at the darkest chapter of your life on live TV? Keep watching, because beyond the sparks and the silence lies a truth many of us carry, but few ever dare to speak aloud. You could feel it before you saw it, like static in the air before a storm breaks. The lights dimmed. The studio audience leaned forward, not because someone told them to, but because something primal told them this wasn't going to be a typical interview. A red on-air light blinked once. Then again, the countdown was whispered, not spoken. 5, 4, 3. Vance sat beneath a halo of harsh white light, his posture impeccable, his face unreadable. Not tense, not relaxed, just waiting. Like a man used to walking into rooms where every eye expected him to fail. And then came her voice. No greeting, no warm-up, no context. Just a shot fired straight through the silence. "Senator Vance," Megyn Kelly said, her tone as smooth as it was surgical. "How does it feel knowing you've betrayed the very people who trusted you?" The words landed like a slap. Audible gasps rippled through the audience. One woman even dropped her notepad. Someone in the back laughed, nervously. A man coughed, too loudly. And JD? He didn't flinch. He turned his head slowly toward the camera. Not toward Megyn, not toward the host who just accused him of betrayal on live television, but toward the nation, toward the millions watching, toward us. And then he smiled. Not a politician's smile, not a damage control grin. It was something else entirely. The smile of a man who had already buried his fear in the backyard long ago and left a shovel sticking out of the dirt. The pause was brutal. 8 full seconds of silence. You could hear the air conditioning hum. A light above stage flickered. Megyn blinked once. Just once. "I'm sorry, Megyn," JD said, voice calm like a lake before thunder. "Was that your opening question or the verdict?" Megyn arched an eyebrow, cool and unshaken on the surface, but her fingers tapped twice on her cue cards. A tell. There it was. Tension. Not just between guest and host, but in the very architecture of the room. The cameras zoomed tighter. The audience sat like statues. This wasn't just an interview. This was a political ambush wrapped in lights and lipstick. JD hadn't expected mercy. He'd read the room before stepping in. He knew Megyn didn't want answers. She wanted to unravel him. Live. In HD. "Betrayal," he repeated slowly. "You use that word so easily. Makes me wonder how often you've tasted it." Now Megyn smiled, but it was the smile of a lioness who'd just found out her prey can bite. "Oh, we're playing that game?" she said. And then something changed. Not on the surface, but somewhere underneath. A flicker behind Megyn's eyes, a slight tilt of JD's shoulders. Because this wasn't just about policy anymore. It wasn't just JD Vance versus Megyn Kelly. It was something deeper. A battle between two versions of America. And they had just stepped into the ring. The clock in the control room hit 7:01 p.m. The show had barely begun. But if you were watching, you already knew. This would be the kind of interview people wouldn't stop talking about. Not because of what was said, but because of what it revealed. The studio lights seemed hotter now, harsher, as if the electricity itself could feel the tension simmering under the surface. JD's calm deflection had stunned the room into silence. But that silence had a heartbeat, and it was speeding up. Megyn didn't blink this time. She shifted in her seat, not out of discomfort, but out of preparation. The smile returned to her face, crisp, confident, rehearsed, and with it, a stack of note cards in her left hand. They looked harmless, but anyone watching closely could see the sharpened edges. "Let's remind the American people who you really are," she began, her voice sugar-wrapped steel. "You've bent over backwards to defend a man who called fallen soldiers losers. You've voted to slash funding for food stamps in the middle of a recession. You've backed near-total abortion bans without exception. 3 punches, one after another, scripted, calculated, designed not to debate, but to corner." JD didn't respond right away, and the silence this time, it wasn't calm, it was coiled, loaded with something unspoken. His fingers tapped twice on the chair's armrest, echoing Megyn's earlier tick. A subtle mirror, intentional, deliberate. "You want a spectacle," he said finally, his voice low, steady, and undeniably dangerous. "Not a conversation. You want blood. Let's give you some." The gasp was louder this time, not a whisper, but a collective, "Oh, he's not playing defense anymore." Megyn leaned back slightly surprised. Not because he pushed back, but because he invited the fight. And the audience? They weren't sure whether to lean in or look away. "Oh, I'm all ears, Senator," she said with that signature grin. "Let's hear your defense." But JD didn't offer one. "No," he said. "Let's talk about your defense, of power, of wealth, of war when it serves your ratings, and silence when it doesn't." Now she went quiet. "You want to list what I've done?" he continued, locking eyes with her. "Fine. I've stood by the man who got laughed out of New York, but still carried Ohio. I voted against bloated welfare that traps people in dependency. And yes, I support protecting unborn children because I've seen the cost of pretending they don't exist." The studio felt smaller somehow, the lights heavier. This wasn't just back and forth anymore. It was combustion. Something raw was cracking through the polish. "But let me ask you this," JD said, pointing gently but firmly. "When was the last time you were hungry? Really hungry. Not Whole30 hungry. Not missed a lunch hungry. But feed my kid or pay rent hungry." Megyn didn't move. Because the people who tuned in tonight, some of them know that feeling. And I'd rather take 10 punches from you than forget that I used to be one of them. There it was. The shift. Not a pivot. Not a performance. A pulse. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't dare. But something in the room thawed, just slightly. Megyn's team in the control room scrambled, whispering into headsets. This wasn't going according to plan. "Senator," she said carefully, resetting, "you're trying to rewrite your own record." JD leaned forward now, elbows on knees, gaze unflinching. "No, Megyn, I'm just refusing to let you write it for me." The live feed stayed locked on him, camera unmoving. Because sometimes television doesn't need motion to keep you frozen. And just like that, what started as a takedown was turning into a reckoning, for both of them. The silence after JD's last sentence wasn't empty, it was charged. It wasn't the kind of pause producers like. It was the kind of pause they fear, the kind that can't be edited out, the kind that demands to be felt. Megyn shifted slightly in her seat, but the movement gave her away. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The tiniest crack in a fortress built from decades of media mastery. JD had found something, a seam, a soft spot, and now he pressed. "You talk about loyalty," JD said, voice steady but louder now, as if testing how far the cameras would follow him. "But let's talk about yours." Megyn blinked, just once. Her smile remained, but the warmth behind it was gone, replaced by calculation. JD leaned in just enough to shorten the distance, but not enough to invade it. He wasn't raising his voice. He didn't need to. "You made millions selling fear," he said, calm as a confession, "to people earning $12 an hour, while sipping wine behind studio glass and telling them they were under attack. Flashbulb moment. The words hung in the air like shrapnel. A line so cutting, so unforgiving, the room forgot to breathe. Even the camera operator, a veteran of hundreds of live shoots, missed a cue. The lens trembled. Megyn's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes recoiled. This wasn't in the prep packet. This wasn't one of the talking points. JD had gone off script and taken the script with him. You built your empire, he continued, eyes locked onto hers, on convincing people that every neighbor was an enemy, that every school was indoctrinating their kids, and that every election was a war. And now you're sitting across from me, talking about my disconnection. No one spoke. Not in the room, not in the control booth, not in homes across the Midwest where JD's voters watched on cracked screens in dusty kitchens, or in Brooklyn apartments where staffers for rival campaigns suddenly muted everything else. Megyn finally responded, but it wasn't a retort. It was a reset. This isn't about me, she said a little too fast. This is about your record. But JD didn't flinch. No, it is about you, and about everyone like you who thinks they get to define what authentic looks like from behind a teleprompter. The audience, silent until now, began shifting in their seats. A few murmurs. One whispered, "Damn." Someone near the back exhaled the breath they'd been holding for a full minute. Megyn picked up another card from her lap, her armor, but JD kept going. You've never missed a mortgage payment, never spent hours in a hospital waiting room with a sick kid and no insurance, but you've cashed in on pretending you understand people who have. That's not journalism. That's theater. His tone never spiked. His delivery was surgical. It wasn't anger. It was exposure. And nothing terrifies the powerful more than being seen without their mask. Megyn sat still, composed, but the lines around her eyes had changed. Tighter now, less polished. You call me a populist, JD said, like it's a dirty word, but I'd rather be guilty of standing with the forgotten than making a fortune off their fears. At that moment, the tension broke, not with applause, not with gasps, but with a dead, echoing stillness. One where every viewer leaned closer. The game had changed. JD hadn't just answered her attack. He'd turned the mirror around, and in doing so, rewrote the rules of the stage she thought she owned. Megyn blinked once, then twice, as if trying to process the unexpected silence in her own studio. The control room hadn't cued the next segment. JD hadn't finished his point, and somehow no one dared interrupt. The weight of what had just happened lingered like humidity, thick, invisible, and pressing. Then JD did something no one expected. He broke his own rhythm. No more policy talk, no more fire. Just a pause, a breath. And then without looking at her, he said, "You know what my grandma used to say when I'd start crying as a kid? She'd say, 'You don't get to cry unless you're bleeding.'" Megyn's brow twitched. A few people in the crowd shifted in their seats. No one understood where he was going, yet. JD looked out toward the audience, not at them, but through them, like he was staring into another place, another time. "I was 11, he continued, voice softer now, curled up under the porch because my mom's boyfriend had come home drunk again. The shouting turned to breaking things, and breaking things turned to fists. I crawled out of a basement window and hid under rotting wood and spiderwebs for 2 hours, just waiting for the yelling to stop. You could have heard a pin drop. That wasn't a storybook. That wasn't inspiration. That was survival. And when people like you," he turned back to Megyn now, gaze sharp but not cruel, "mock where I come from, call it ignorant or backwards. What you're really mocking are people who had no map, no safety net, and no voice." He paused again, this time letting it sit longer. Not for effect, but because he needed to. The words cost something. Hillbilly Elegy wasn't a book. It was a trauma report. Every page was a scar I didn't think anyone would care about. But they did, because millions of Americans don't just know that pain, they live it every day. Megyn uncharacteristically said nothing. Her face was unreadable, but not because she was composed, because she was cornered in unfamiliar emotional territory. "You sit there," JD said, with a team of stylists, researchers, and commercial breaks. But you've never once had to wipe blood off your shirt before school because you stepped between your mom and a man who hated her drinking more than he loved her. Now the audience didn't know where to look. Some stared at the floor, others straight at JD. No one dared glance at Megyn. I didn't ask to be a voice for anyone, but when I speak for them, for every kid who's ever hidden under a porch, for every grandmother who held a broken family together with food stamps and grit, for every man who grew up thinking survival was the best he could aim for. Megyn finally responded. Her voice was quieter, cautious. So, you're saying I don't understand poverty? JD's reply came not with anger, but certainty. I'm saying you never asked to. It wasn't an insult. It was an indictment, one the audience couldn't unhear. The tone in the room had shifted again, this time from political sparring to something more elemental. Truth-telling. The J.D. Vance, who now sat on Megyn Kelly's stage, was no longer just a senator. He was a memory with a microphone, a trauma survivor in a tailored suit, holding up the mirror no one else dared lift. And for the first time, it was Megyn who looked like she wanted to crawl under the porch and hide. Megyn shifted in her chair. She glanced briefly to the producer off camera, but there was no saving cue, no laugh track, no graphics to hide behind. JD's raw confessions had sucked the oxygen from the studio, but Megyn Kelly was a veteran in the art of regaining control, and she wasn't about to let her own stage become a confessional booth for a man who once called Trump a scourge and then kissed his ring. So she pivoted. So, Senator, she said with a composed smirk, is this the new J.D. Vance, the Yale-educated version, the one who learned how to cry on cue? Laughter. A few in the audience chuckled, nervously, unsure whether this was okay. J.D. didn't blink. He had heard that tone before. You know, I remember Yale, he said. I remember walking into that first seminar with a shirt I thought looked expensive. It cost $12 at Target. The crowd went quiet again. And I remember the girl next to me, tortoise-shell glasses, trust fund eyebrows. She asked me if I was visiting from maintenance. I laughed because I didn't want to punch her. Megyn leaned forward, intrigued. J.D. continued. They laughed at my accent. They asked if I'd ever shot a raccoon. I was called a token redneck so many times I started to wonder if I should get it tattooed. He paused, just long enough for the irony to burn. Yale wasn't a dream come true, it was a zoo, and I was the exhibit. People stared like I was something they read about but never expected to smell. I wasn't diverse to them. I was a reminder that America's wounds don't come with filters. Megyn chuckled, that cold upward laugh that had iced out dozens of male guests before. Oh, come on, she said. You act like they put you in a cage. You went to Yale, J.D. Most Americans would kill for that. And that's when he snapped, not with rage, but with force. His voice didn't rise, it cut. I survived things that would have broken your makeup artist, Megyn. Don't test me. The silence returned, deeper this time. Even the floor manager's pen stilled midair. J.D. leaned back, but his eyes were locked onto her now. You ever walk into a room where every eye thinks you're lucky just to be standing there, when they've had their whole lives handed to them? You ever try to explain to a professor why the sound of glass breaking still makes you flinch? No response. J.D. exhaled slowly. They didn't hate me, but they didn't see me either. Not for who I was, just for what I represented. A crack in their polished mirror. Megyn adjusted her posture. The lines on her notepad suddenly felt irrelevant. You think I forgot who I am because I wore a Yale pin? He asked. No, what I remember most was how lonely it felt. Not because I didn't belong, but because I did, and it scared them. It was less an accusation, more an indictment of a world that wanted his story, but not his scars. So when you laugh, Megyn, when you joke about how I speak or where I studied, just remember, your world is the performance. Mine was survival. And I've spent every day since trying to make sure no kid ever feels like a curiosity just because their dad fixed cars instead of managing portfolios. She said nothing, and he didn't wait for her to. Because the fight had moved somewhere else now, beyond Yale, beyond politics, into the very marrow of who gets to define dignity in America. JD didn't wait for applause. He wasn't hunting for sympathy or gas. His words weren't rehearsed, and that's what made them sting more than any pre-written monologue. The air in the studio had changed, not tense but heavier, as if the truth itself was finally sitting among them. And he leaned forward, both elbows on the desk, steady and unblinking. You know, the real divide in this country, it's not left versus right, he said, his voice quieter now, but somehow more commanding. It's not red states and blue states. It's not even about who you vote for anymore. He paused, just long enough for people to lean in. It's studio versus front porch. Megyn blinked, confused by the phrasing. JD saw it and pushed further. You sit here, lights, makeup, applause signs. You ask questions you already wrote answers to. You frame narratives like paintings in a gallery. But that's not the country I know. His jaw tightened slightly and the Ohio in his vowels came back strong. You ever knock on a door that's falling off the hinges? You ever sit on a porch with someone whose dad lost his pension and his pride in the same month? He didn't need her to respond. I have. And I wasn't there with a camera crew or a tweet lined up. I was there because I am that guy. I was that kid. You laugh at where I came from, but those same forgotten people? They raised me. They handed me their trust. And they don't give that out easily, especially not to politicians. Megyn tried to cut in, some attempt at retaking control, but JD wasn't done. You keep asking why I changed, but did you ever think the country changed first? The people you mock, the ones who shop at Dollar General, who pray when the rent's late, who bury their parents in shirts they wore to work that morning, those people, they didn't invite themselves to this America. They were shoved out of it. Now the audience wasn't just listening. They were watching differently. Something had shifted. They don't go viral. They don't get invited on podcasts or magazine covers, but they vote and they remember. And when someone like me shows up and doesn't talk down to them, they don't care what school I went to. They care if I show up again. He pointed, not at Megyn, but at the lens, at the millions watching. You want to know what it's like to be them? Try losing your job, your home, and your hope, and still being told you're the problem. Try watching your town disappear while pundits joke about flyover states. Try being called racist, stupid, dangerous, just for being poor and white in the wrong zip code. He sat back, but the force of his words still hovered between them. I'm not here to impress you, Megyn. I'm here because they can't be. I've walked through living rooms that smelled like grief. I've met kids who eat cereal for dinner and think that's normal. They're not props. They're not punchlines. And if you'd ever met them, really met them, you'd know. You don't get to laugh at their pain just because the makeup light makes it easy to. She didn't respond. Couldn't. Because in that moment, the set wasn't hers anymore. The script had burned. And J.D. Vance, for all his contradictions, had pulled a whole America into that room. The uninvited one, the unphotographed one, the one whose silence had just been broken. There was a pause, brief but biting, after J.D.'s last sentence. Megyn adjusted the papers on her desk, not because she needed to, but because she needed something to do with her hands. The studio was still hot with the truth J.D. had just laid bare. And for a second, it looked like she might shift tone, maybe even retreat. But then, like clockwork, she reset, eyes sharp, voice sharpened further. Tell me, Senator, she asked with a tight, performative calm, when did your soul sell? The room tensed again. J.D. didn't flinch, not even a blink. He turned toward her, not angry, but almost amused, as if he'd waited months, maybe years, for someone to finally ask that question out loud. You mean Trump? He said. You mean, do I regret supporting him? He leaned back, laced his fingers, and smiled. Not smug, just steady. Let me tell you what I regret, Megyn. I regret how you covered him. I regret how your industry crowned him a ratings god when it suited you, and then turned him into a demon the second your cocktail circles demanded it. Megyn's expression didn't move, but her jaw set tighter. You want to talk about soul selling? J.D. continued. He didn't create the circus. He walked into it. And while millions of desperate, decent Americans were trying to figure out why nobody in Washington heard them, You gave them a show instead of a microphone. You packaged fear into Nielsen points and then told the same people they were dangerous for clapping too loud. His voice was measured, almost quiet, but beneath the stillness was a current of something fierce. I stood on factory floors in VFW halls beside parents who buried their kids in war or fentanyl, and I didn't need a teleprompter to hear them. They weren't asking for a savior. They were asking for someone, anyone, who wouldn't laugh in their face when they begged for a little dignity. And say what you want about Donald Trump, but he looked them in the eye, and they looked back. There was no room for spin now. The air felt too real for that. So no, JD said, voice firmer now, almost like a warning. I don't regret the man. I regret the mirror you held up to him. Distorted, curated, designed to provoke, not to inform. You told America he was fire, and then you poured gasoline on your own set. Not because you feared him, but because you needed him. And now you want to judge the people who stayed warm beside that fire because they had no other heat? That's not journalism, Megyn. That's theater. And I've lived enough real pain to know the difference. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, Megyn Kelly wasn't interviewing J.D. Vance anymore. She was staring at a man who had been both inside the machine and chewed up by it, and who somehow came out the other side not begging for forgiveness, but returning the gaze. And for the first time in the entire interview, it was her turn to be silent. The silence that followed JD's indictment was not the kind that invited calm. It was the kind that dared someone to speak next. And Megyn Kelly, too seasoned to retreat, too proud to yield, did exactly what he expected. She came at him with fire. You're deflecting, she snapped, voice sharper now, volume creeping upward. You talk about media distortion, but what about integrity, Senator? What about your responsibility to the people who feel misled now? Who feel like you've turned into exactly what you ran against? Her words landed hard, but JD remained still, dangerously still. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in the stillness that unsettled more than any outburst could have. The air in the studio grew taut again, the kind of tightness that warned something bigger was coming. JD waited until the last syllable of her rebuke dissolved, then leaned forward, not to shout, not to strike, but to speak so clearly, so plainly, that even the cameras seemed to lean in. You want to talk about integrity, Megyn, he said quietly. Fine. Let's talk about yours. The smile on her face stiffened, only slightly, but enough to notice. He reached into the stack of notes beside him, slowly, deliberately, like a man not drawing a weapon but drawing receipts. He held up a worn transcript. Then, just as calm as before, he said, Do you remember this one? When I was a kid, blackface was just fun. Your words, on air. Fox News, October 23rd, 2018. The smile finally cracked. JD didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice or point a finger. He let the quote hang, unadorned, radioactive in its own truth. Would you like me to roll the clip, Megyn? He asked gently, eyes steady. Or should I let you explain it to the audience you're pretending to protect? She blinked, once, twice. Her hands moved, but no words followed. JD continued, voice like a scalpel. You talk about people feeling betrayed? Try being a black kid watching you justify mockery as nostalgia. Try explaining to your daughter why a woman with a platform gets to laugh at pain and still call herself a journalist. Now the entire control room was still. The staff didn't know whether to cut to commercial or pray it wasn't happening live. But it was, every second of it. And for the first time in the interview, Megyn's voice didn't rise, because there was nowhere left for it to go that wouldn't unravel her. JD didn't need a crowd behind him. He didn't even need applause. His power came from something colder, older, earned, from years of swallowing slights, from classrooms where his accent got mocked, from boardrooms where he was called a fluke, from nights under the porch hiding from a man's fists, from funerals that didn't make headlines, from silence that taught him how to listen, even when the world only wanted to shout. And in that stillness, Megyn Kelly burned alone. Megyn didn't respond, not because she lacked a retort, but because JD had pulled the curtain back on something she couldn't spin. Not in real time, not with millions watching, Not when the mirror he held up didn't just reflect her, but all of them. The camera panned slightly, catching the smallest tremble in her breath before she masked it behind a sip of water. Too late. JD had already smelled blood, but not the kind that satisfies predators, the kind that signals an era has ended. He sat forward, voice lower now, steadier than before, like a man who didn't come to win an argument, but to close a wound. You made your career humiliating soft targets, he said plainly, without venom. Struggling single moms, college students who cried during protests, janitors, veterans, black kids in hoodies, women with accents. You pointed at them, smirked, and gave America permission to laugh. And for a while, it worked. He paused. Not for drama, but because the truth needed air to settle. You expected one today, JD continued. You thought you'd sit across from a man ashamed of where he came from, desperate to impress you, hoping you'd treat him gently if he behaved just right. His eyes locked with hers. Instead, you got a mirror. It wasn't just a line, it was a turning point. His voice carried no flourish, no theatrics. Just grief, grief turned steel. The grief of having to bury your mother not with dignity, but with apology. The grief of learning that some deaths never get eulogies, only statistics. And suddenly, JD wasn't speaking to Megyn Kelly anymore. He was speaking to every viewer who knew what it was to be laughed at and edited out. My mother, JD said, quieter now, died with $2 in her purse and a body full of pills no rehab ever fixed. Not because she was weak, because no one came for her. Not government, not church, not media, nobody. Kelly shifted in her seat. The control room signaled for commercial, but the producer held back. Something real was happening. Too rare, too dangerous to cut away from. JD exhaled. She died alone, while people like you were on prime time asking whether poor kids needed free lunch or tough love. While you called whole communities lazy from studios that never smell like bleach or blood or stale bread. And when she died, do you know what I thought? He leaned in. I thought she was never a headline worth reading. The silence after that wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Because J.D. Vance had just ripped open the playbook of modern politics, not with anger, but with witness. And for the first time, his voice wasn't defending Trump or Ohio or hillbilly elegy. It was defending the invisible dead, the ones who never got interviews, the ones too poor to matter until election cycles. He didn't need to win the debate. He already had. And as the camera slowly zoomed in, Megyn swallowed hard. She knew this wasn't a man trying to score points. It was a man who'd buried enough soft targets to know he'd never let himself be one again. The silence that hung in the studio after JD's final words was the kind that rewires air itself. Even Megyn, a master of transitions, struggled to swallow it back into sound. She cleared her throat, tightened her jaw, and almost defensively flicked her pen against her notepad like a nervous tick. So, she said, that's quite a story. But let's be honest, Senator, you sound emotional. JD didn't flinch. He didn't blink, and he certainly didn't smile. Instead, he leaned forward just enough for the microphone to feel closer and stated the next line as if it had waited years to be said. No, he said, I'm not emotional. I'm present. You should try it sometime. The line didn't just land, it erupted. The audience, already stunned into stillness, ignited with spontaneous applause. Some clapped out of agreement, others out of relief. But all of them felt something shift. For once, the man on camera wasn't performing. He was remembering. JD let the noise settle before continuing. His tone didn't rise, but deepened. You want numbers? I'll give you 3. That's how many overdoses I attended personally in 1 year. Not as a senator, not as an author, as a neighbor. His voice sharpened, not loud but surgical. The first was a boy named Eli, 21, still had braces on his top teeth. His mother begged me not to call the ambulance because she couldn't afford another bill she wouldn't get to pay. I held his shoulder while his eyes went glassy. The audience was silent again, not out of politeness, out of shock. The second, JD continued, a woman I'd known since I was a kid. She once gave me an extra peanut butter sandwich when I forgot mine at school. That day, I found her with a needle still in her arm, slumped against a laundry machine that hadn't worked in years. Her daughter was upstairs, screaming for someone who wouldn't wake up. Megan's pen had stopped moving. Her face was tight, guarded, but her eyes flickered, just slightly, as if some part of her brain realized, this isn't a press cycle, this is a man mid-confession. And the third, JD said softly, was the son of my high school friend, 16. He didn't die right away, but I watched the life leave him across 4 hours of waiting room chairs and nurses who stopped calling him by name. He let that sentence hang for a beat. That's what I've buried, he said. Not headlines, not legacies, neighbors. Megyn opened her mouth to respond but thought better of it. JD saw it and nodded, as if confirming the thing neither of them wanted to say out loud. You think this is about Trump? JD said. It's not. It's about a country that learned how to narrate pain from behind glass, but forgot how to sit in it. You want to ask me about policy? Ask me, but don't dismiss the people I lost as anecdotes just because your segment needs a pivot. He glanced down at the stack of prepared questions on her table, then back at her. This isn't content. This is my life. And just like that, the studio transformed again, not into a debate stage, but into a funeral home built out of cameras and silence. Because when a man stands in front of you and says, I've buried neighbors, not headlines, you either listen or you forfeit the right to ask what's real. The silence after JD's last words wasn't just respectful. It was stunned. Megyn sat back in her chair, eyes narrowed not in judgment now, but calculation. She was starting to understand that this wasn't a campaign appearance. This was confession as confrontation. And JD Vance wasn't done. He took a slow breath, as if pulling something up from far beneath the studio floor. You know what we grew up with, he said, voice steadier now. Broken faith and broken glass. That's the gospel where I'm from. No stained glass windows, no choruses, just screaming matches that ended in slammed doors or sirens. The room was still, cameras panned in, and even the lighting crew leaned forward. My grandma once patched a window with duct tape because she couldn't afford to fix it. I was 8. Every winter wind that blew in was a reminder of where we stood in the American dream, outside, looking through plastic. He didn't speak these lines with bitterness. There was a strange calm in his tone, like a man reciting scripture, not from a pulpit, but from a porch swing. You sat in studios calling us backwards, dangerous, ignorant, JD said, finally turning his eyes to Megyn again. But the truth is, people like me built your damn network towers. We soldered the wires that carried your voice into America's living rooms. We fixed the signals when your satellite feed dropped mid-segment. And we did it with cracked knuckles, third shift sleep, and no insurance. Megyn opened her mouth to interrupt, but JD cut in with practiced ease, like a man who's been talked over one too many times. You mocked our accents while you cashed checks because of our ratings. You called us flyover country, but didn't flinch when our jobs flew over to places you couldn't pronounce. His voice didn't rise, but it tightened, like rope under strain. You want to know what the real divide is, Megyn? He asked. It's not red versus blue. It's not even rural versus urban. It's the people who build things versus the people who think visibility is value. You got famous explaining us. I got tired living it. A beat. No applause this time. Just a deep, uneasy silence, like the room itself had realized it was being indicted. JD leaned back, finally letting the tension out of his shoulders. This isn't some hillbilly elegy. It's a damn ledger, and I came here to balance it. Megyn glanced down at her cards, searching for a pivot, but nothing in her stack had prepared her for this. A man who didn't just survive shame, he'd learned to wield it. And for a fleeting moment, even the producers behind the glass seemed to understand. This wasn't an interview anymore. This was reckoning wrapped in flannel and fire. JD let his final words settle like ash in the silence that followed. Across the stage, Megyn Kelly sat composed, but something in her posture had shifted, like the scaffolding beneath her confidence had quietly buckled, and the audience could feel it. JD's voice returned, not louder but lower, like something closer to the bone. I don't speak in slogans. I wasn't raised with them, he said. We didn't have manifestos on the fridge. We had eviction notices. My politics? They were shaped by a mother who sometimes chose between milk and rent. By a grandmother who didn't ask if I was okay, because she was too busy making me okay. He paused, not for effect, but to choose a truth that could still be heard over the hum of studio tension. I don't fight to impress networks or win applause. I fight for the right to survive. That's it. That's the measure. If that makes me radical, I'll wear it like a badge from home. A soft inhale rippled through the rows of seated guests. One man, dressed in a worn denim jacket, blinked rapidly, eyes glassing over. A woman a few seats down leaned toward her daughter and whispered, "Finally." Someone said it, and JD, though he didn't acknowledge the moment, seemed to sense it. He let his hands rest on the desk. No gesturing, no flourish, just stillness. A man who had nothing left to sell because he'd already paid with everything. I get asked all the time, he said, why would someone like me stand next to someone like Trump? Or walk into rooms where I know I'll be the punchline? He looked directly at Megyn now, not confrontational, conversational. Because power doesn't change things on its own. Pressure does. And sometimes the only way to apply pressure is from the inside. Even when it hurts. Even when it costs you everything you thought made you respectable. Megyn raised an eyebrow, maybe a flicker of curiosity in the skepticism, but she stayed quiet. JD continued to steady. I've buried friends who OD'd 5 miles from Fortune 500 headquarters. I've held hands at VA clinics where the walls were older than the patients, and I've walked into policy meetings where people talked about Appalachia like it was a failed experiment, not a living, breathing home. He turned from Megyn and looked out into the crowd, not at anyone in particular, but into the room, like he wanted the walls to hear it too. When you grow up knowing that failure has your last name, survival becomes a political act. We didn't get to choose that, but we sure as hell get to fight for it. For a moment, the studio lights seemed less important than the shadows they couldn't touch. This wasn't theater, it wasn't campaign rhetoric. It was a man from Middletown, Ohio, offering something rare, not a performance, but a proof of life. And without any script telling them to, several audience members began to clap. Soft at first, then stronger, not for what he said, but for what it cost to say it. Megyn watched, and in her eyes something flickered between acknowledgement and retreat. But JD didn't look back at her. He was already somewhere else, in the room she'd never entered among people who didn't watch this network, but lived its consequences. And for the first time in the broadcast, Megyn had no follow-up. Because when survival speaks with clarity, spin goes silent. The clip hit Twitter like a thunderclap at midnight. Within 15 minutes, hashtag Vance Unfiltered was trending in 6 cities. By morning, it was global. The line that detonated the internet wasn't shouted. It was spoken with calm, almost surgical precision. You didn't interview me, Megyn. You exposed yourself. Someone had clipped the moment, added subtitles, and slowed the camera just enough to feel the silence that followed her frozen expression. The video went viral, not because JD yelled, but because he didn't have to. 7 million views by dawn, 12 by noon. TikTok feeds looped it. Reaction videos mushroomed. YouTubers labeled it the moment everything shifted. Even political rivals, usually quick to dismiss JD, paused to process. Because for once, the fire wasn't partisan. It was personal. It was real. In a single night, JD Vance had done what no Senate hearing, no campaign rally, no opinion column could. He punctured the media machine from the inside. Megyn's team had tried to regain control. They released a statement about spirited debate. They emphasized their commitment to diverse viewpoints. But the internet had already moved on. From her. Clips flooded Instagram reels with side-by-sides. JD talking about buried neighbors, Kelly deflecting with glossed-over smiles. Memes showed her face mid-blink, overlaid with JD's most cutting lines. But the cruelty wasn't in the edits. It was in the contrast. JD didn't win an argument, one tweet read. He held up a mirror. And she blinked. Cable networks scrambled. CNN replayed the segment 3 times. Fox News barely mentioned it. MSNBC called it one of the most unguarded political interviews in recent memory. But what rattled everyone, especially Kelly's camp, was how many ordinary people shared it not as political content, but as catharsis. The crowd that had been in studio, half of them posted selfies afterward, their captions variations of, "I was there when the room broke open." Some conservative commentators tried to label JD's words as betrayal. Others called him unhinged. But that narrative didn't stick, because JD hadn't flipped sides. He had simply dropped the mask, and it landed. "I've buried neighbors, not headlines," he had said. "You should try being present." That clip alone had 3 million views and counting. Podcasts the next morning weren't asking, "What did JD mean?" They were asking, "Why don't more senators talk like this?" On Reddit, someone wrote, "It's not that I agree with everything JD says, I don't, but it felt like, for once, someone from power remembered what pain sounds like." That was the echo. Not victory, not spin, recognition. JD wasn't tweeting, he wasn't gloating, he wasn't retweeting praise or firing off hot takes. He had gone quiet, which in a way only amplified the moment, because real conviction doesn't need a mic check. And in the echo chamber of American media, JD Vance had done the unthinkable. He made the noise stop, even if only for a minute. But everyone watching knew that minute would echo for months. It started with a pause in the Monday numbers, then a plummet. Kelly's ratings nosedived 38% in 48 hours. By Thursday, segments that once drew 2 million live viewers were barely clearing half. The analytics team tried to blame algorithms, the weather, even NBA playoffs, but nobody bought it. The headlines told the truth. Vance silences, Kelly, America watches. What followed wasn't just a media hiccup. It was erosion, fast, public, and painful. First came the advertisers. One by one, they pulled out. A health supplement giant canceled its 6-month campaign. A major telecom froze its digital spots. 2 national brands quietly suspended deals, pending internal review. Their messages were brief, cold, and lawyer-proof. "This no longer aligns with our brand values." Next came the guests. By Friday, 3 high-profile bookings vanished from the week's lineup. A best-selling author canceled hours before airtime. A senator's aide called the producers with a curt line, "Not the optics we need right now." Behind the scenes, panic set in. Her publicist went dark for 12 hours. When they finally resurfaced, it was with a carefully worded press release meant to soothe and spin. This conversation was passionate and robust. Megyn Kelly stands by her commitment to fearless journalism and open dialogue. "We welcome all perspectives." The internet wasn't interested. Screenshots of the statement were met with mockery. One comment read, "The only thing she welcomed was getting wrecked on live TV." Another went viral with 80,000 likes. You can't call it fearless journalism when you flinch at the truth. Inside the studio, morale cracked. One crew member described it as, like working on the Titanic, after the iceberg. Rumors spread, producers clashing in meetings, emails flagged urgent piling up, even a whispered rebranding pitch to shift the focus away from politics entirely. A few staffers quietly updated their LinkedIn. Kelly, once untouchable, had become the story, and not in the way she liked. Her face still appeared on billboards across Manhattan, but now they felt like relics, out of place, ghosts from a moment that had already moved on. And the cruelest part? JD hadn't done a victory lap. He didn't need to. His silence rang louder than any rebuttal. Kelly tried to pivot. She booked a follow-up panel on media bias in modern discourse, but no one watched. She invited 2 conservative influencers to weigh in on rural values and representation, but they canceled last minute, citing travel conflicts. In truth, they didn't want to sit where JD Vance had sat and risk being compared. One network executive, off record, put it bluntly, she miscalculated. She thought she was controlling the spotlight. Turns out she was standing in it. By the end of the week, producers were whispering about moving her time slot. Ratings consultants started advising a format overhaul. Advertisers quietly reallocated budgets elsewhere. Kelly walked into the Friday taping with perfect hair and a steady gait, but the air was thin. She smiled for the camera. The red light blinked. The segment began. But the energy had shifted. This wasn't a comeback. This was a stall, a scramble, a woman trying to keep the stage from collapsing beneath her heels. The world had watched JD stand up. Now it was watching Kelly slip down. They didn't expect it. Not like this. By Sunday morning, JD's team inbox had crossed 18,000 messages, and counting. They had to set up autoresponders. Too many came into sort. Some were just a subject line and nothing more. Others were essays, breaking open like old wounds finally given permission to breathe. One came from a steelworker in Indiana. He wrote, "For the first time in my life, I didn't feel ashamed of my story. I watched that interview with my wife. We didn't say a word until it ended. Then she looked at me and said, 'He sounds like you.' I cried. That never happens. Not over politics, not over TV. But it felt like someone finally saw us." Another came from a woman in Kentucky. "You spoke like someone who remembers what cold trailer floors feel like." Dozens echoed the same phrase. I thought I was alone. And what was stunning, what nobody on Kelly's side had calculated, was how wide the emotional net spread. This wasn't just JD's base. Emails came from school teachers in Oakland, nurses in Tulsa, cab drivers in Newark, war veterans from Pennsylvania who hadn't voted since 2008. They weren't all conservative. They weren't all white, but they knew what it felt like to be dismissed, brushed off, flattened into punchlines. JD had stood in a studio designed to shrink him and refused to shrink. Clips of his words had gone everywhere. Not the fiery jabs, but the quiet ones. The ones where he didn't attack, he named. Where he didn't rant, he remembered. "You don't know pain until you bury 3 friends in a year and still clock in Monday morning. I've lived on both sides of the tracks. One side pities you, the other forgets you exist." Those lines were repeated in coffee shops, printed in church bulletins, whispered at night between parents wondering how to raise kids without losing their dignity. Reporters tried to frame it as unexpected populism, but to JD it wasn't strategy, it was testimony. In private, he told his comms director, "People think it was about Kelly. It wasn't. It was about the people who don't get invited into the room unless we bring them in our mouth." Somewhere in Ohio, a high school civics teacher played the full clip in class, asked her students, "What makes someone powerful? Who decides?" In the back row, a boy who never raised his hand finally did. "I think power is when you scare people by just being real." Back at JD's office, his staff printed out 150 of the messages, pinned them to a corkboard, not for show, for grounding. Aide Mike Ferris looked up from the wall and said quietly, "Feels like we woke up a country no one wanted to admit was still here." JD didn't smile. He didn't posture. He just nodded, because he knew something that couldn't be faked. The shame was never theirs to carry. It belonged to the ones who mocked them into silence, who turned survival into spectacle, who mistook struggle for stupidity. And this week, just this once, the spotlight swung back, and the question it lit up for America wasn't, "What just happened?" It was, who's afraid of the hillbilly now? The studio lights had dimmed. The stage crew whispered like they were afraid to disturb something sacred. JD sat alone backstage, still in his suit, though he'd loosened the collar just enough to breathe. His hands rested on the note cards he'd barely looked at during the interview, but he wasn't reading them now. He was staring at a small folded photo. Taped to the back of the final index card was a picture of his grandmother. She wasn't smiling in it. She never did for cameras. But she was there, arms crossed on the porch of the house they almost lost 3 times before JD turned 18. The wood behind her was cracked. The door leaned. The railing was gone. But she stood like a damn statue. JD exhaled and whispered, "You did good, Mama." I didn't blink. He could still hear her voice sometimes. Not soft. Never soft. She wasn't the type. She used to slam the skillet on the stove at 6 a.m. and say, "If you want to be heard in this world, you better show up loud and ready." He hadn't known exactly what that meant until today. The adrenaline had worn off. What remained was a strange quiet. Not peace, but gravity. He didn't celebrate what had just happened on camera. He didn't gloat, because deep down, he knew what it cost to say what he'd said. The risks weren't theoretical. They were real. Political suicide was always a breath away when you stepped off script. He'd cross lines others tiptoed around, not because it was brave, because it was true. And now in the quiet, he wondered how many of his colleagues would be calling by morning. Not to praise him, but to distance themselves, to ask what the hell he thought he was doing, to say he made it personal. It was personal. Every word. He hadn't planned to bring up his neighbors, or the overdoses, or that one funeral where he stood behind a podium and couldn't get through the damn eulogy without choking. But then Kelly had smiled that smug media smile, the one that asked for permission to laugh at pain. And JD knew she didn't come for answers. She came for dominance, and something inside him refused to shrink. So he named things: the shame, the silence, the sense of invisibility that turns good men mean and tired women numb. And now in the aftermath, the world had seen it, heard it, replayed it 7 million times and counting. But this moment, backstage, wasn't for any of them. Not for the cameras or the trending hashtags or the analysts already framing it in convenient headlines. This moment was for her, his grandmother, the woman who raised him with fire in one hand and Bible verses in the other. The woman who taught him to cook cornbread and fight smart. He picked up the photo again, smoothed the edges with his thumb. "They didn't break me, Mama." He looked up, eyes wet but steady. "And they won't." A crew member peeked in. "Senator? Car's ready when you are." JD nodded, folding the photo carefully and slipping it into his inner jacket pocket. He stood up slowly, shoulders square, but not stiff. Tired, yes, but clear. Because sometimes the most important noise you'll ever make is what you say when no one's watching. The SUV moved steadily through Manhattan traffic, but JD barely noticed. His head leaned against the cool window glass, watching the lights blur by. Outside, the city buzzed as always. Screens flashing, horns barking, pedestrians flowing like water through concrete. But inside the car, it was silent. No one spoke. Not his communications director, not his aide, not even the driver. It wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Like something sacred had just happened, and they weren't sure what to call it yet. At a red light, the youngest staffer, maybe 23, fresh out of a Hill internship, cleared his throat from the passenger seat. "Sir," he said quietly, like he didn't want to break the air, "can I tell you something?" JD turned slightly, just enough to say, "Go ahead." The kid hesitated, then said it in one breath. "My brother dropped out of college last year. Mental health stuff. Debt. He just didn't believe in anything anymore. He watched the interview tonight. He texted me 3 words. I just reapplied." JD didn't answer right away. He didn't ask for the brother's name, didn't ask what school, didn't need to. He just looked at the young man, really looked, and then nodded. Not the politician's nod, not the "thanks for sharing" kind. It was smaller, heavier, like a promise made in silence. Because that was what the cameras missed. Not the viral clip or the soundbite or the trending war on Twitter. Not the headline that framed him as unhinged or righteous depending on the outlet. No, what they missed was this: a single young man who didn't blink, watching his brother come back to life through a screen. That wasn't politics. That was resurrection. And it reminded JD of something he once read but never forgot. The personal is not political. The personal is what the political was always supposed to protect. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the words settle inside him like warm coals. There was no applause in that car, no spotlight, no crowd. But for some reason, it felt bigger than anything that had happened on stage. Moments like these, quiet, personal, off camera, this was where the story really lived. Not in what people shouted, but in what they decided quietly when no one was watching. A man choosing to stand back up, a woman canceling her shame, a brother texting a sentence that carried the weight of hope. The light turned green. The car kept moving. JD's phone buzzed in his coat pocket. Dozens of unread messages, some from donors, some from journalists, a few from old friends who hadn't texted in years. But he didn't reach for it. Instead, he watched the reflection of the city lights ripple against the dark glass. Behind the noise of politics and power, he could feel something shifting, something human, something that didn't need to be announced to be real. He finally spoke, his voice just above a whisper. That's one. The staffer looked over. Sir? JD didn't explain. He didn't need to. He was keeping count. Not of polls, not of clicks or votes or retweets, of people who came back to themselves. By sunrise, the requests were flooding in. Meet the press, face the nation, this week, State of the Union. Every Sunday anchor wanted him. Some were subtle, some aggressive. All made the same pitch. Capitalize on the moment. Ride the wave. You struck a nerve, now dominate the cycle. J.D. Vance read the messages, then closed his laptop. He didn't need more airtime. He needed air. His comms team sat around a long oak table in the Senate office, riding high off the firestorm. One staffer waved analytics, mentions in the millions, approval bumps in swing states, even a clip spliced into a European newsreel. The other played sound bites back on her phone, eyes wide like she couldn't believe they came from her own boss. So who do we call back first? Someone asked. JD leaned back in his chair and said 4 words that froze the room. We're not calling back. Silence. You mean not yet? The scheduler ventured cautiously. You mean we wait a week? JD shook his head. No, I mean we let the moment breathe. The message is already out. It doesn't need me to repeat it until it's empty. He stood, walked over to the window and looked down at Constitution Avenue. Traffic was light. Clouds hung low. Somewhere out there, people were still feeling what happened. Not debating it, not dissecting it. Just feeling. Let them sit with it, he added. Let them argue about it at the dinner table. Let them bring it up in barbershops and union halls. That's where it matters. Not on the 7th panel in a row. But Senator, one aide said, this is the biggest media moment of your career. You could reshape your image overnight. This is spine-straightening stuff. JD turned and faced them. Truth already has a spine. It doesn't need my PR team to hold it up. No one argued after that. There was something final in his tone. Not defensive, but grounded. Like a man who didn't need to explain himself to the algorithm. His strategy wasn't silence. It was sovereignty. He knew this moment wasn't about control. It was about conviction. And conviction doesn't shout to stay relevant. It waits. It watches. It withstands. In a culture addicted to speed, JD was choosing stillness. In a cycle that demanded the next headline, he was resisting the bait. Because real truth doesn't beg to be remembered. It plants itself in the gut. And if it's real, it grows there, quietly, relentlessly. He walked out of the meeting room without fanfare. His staff didn't follow. They just watched, a little stunned, a little awed. Not by what he said, but by what he refused to say. Later that day, a reporter texted him directly. Just heard you passed on all 4 Sunday slots. Why? Missed opportunity? JD typed 1 sentence, then put his phone away. Sometimes power means knowing when to speak and when to stand. There were no satellite trucks, no podium, no moderators, just a dozen rows of mismatched folding chairs arranged in the gym of a rural high school that still used chalkboards and stored trophies in dusty glass. The kids shuffled in slowly, some still smelling faintly of diesel and cafeteria bread. Plaid shirts, steel-toe boots, hand-me-down jeans with oil stains at the cuff. They weren't here for civics credit. They were here because someone told them he was worth hearing. J.D. Vance stood backstage and adjusted the mic clipped awkwardly to his collar. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a faded gray shirt with sleeves pushed up to the forearm and a pair of boots scuffed by more than metaphor. The principal didn't introduce him. There was no fanfare. He simply walked onto the stage. No lights, no music. Just the low squeak of sneakers on waxed tile. He took a moment, let the silence settle. I've stood under brighter lights, JD began, but none that showed me more clearly than this one. A few students leaned forward. I'm not here today to perform. I'm not here to impress. I'm here because the truth doesn't expire once the camera's shut off. It either sticks or it doesn't. He paused and scanned the room, making eye contact with a girl in the front row who clutched a spiral notebook like it held her future. What you say matters more, JD continued, when you've bled for it. The gym stayed quiet, but it wasn't silence from boredom. It was the kind that comes when something lands, the kind that makes teenagers stop scrolling and start listening. He told them about the overdose that took his neighbor, about the 4 a.m. shifts at the mill before he ever knew the word Yale. He spoke of his mama, the one whose framed photo still lived in his briefcase, and how she taught him that spines matter more than sound bites. He didn't talk politics, not once. Instead, he talked place. This town, your hands, your story, they matter. They always did. Even when the world said you were a punchline, even when people like me were told to get out and never look back. He glanced at the basketball hoop dangling half-cocked above his head, then back at the teens. You don't have to leave to matter, and you don't have to perform pain to earn respect. A boy in the back row, quiet, big knuckles, probably works part-time in a garage, nodded just once. It was enough. JD ended without applause. No selfie line. No merch table. He stepped off the stage the same way he stepped on, quietly, boots echoing against tile. As he walked toward the exit, the girl with the notebook approached. She didn't ask for a picture. She didn't ask for advice. She simply said, "Thanks for showing up without needing a show." JD smiled. Not big, not performative, just real. "Thanks for noticing," he said. Then he stepped out into the cold Ohio air, where the wind didn't care who he was, only whether he still remembered where he came from. The hallway outside the gym still hummed with leftover echoes, squeaky sneakers, whispered questions, the thud of an old trophy case being nudged closed. JD walked slowly, boots dragging just a bit, the weight of the morning settling in. He didn't expect much more. The speech was done. The moment had passed. That's when she stepped in front of him. 14, maybe 15. A faded hoodie too big for her frame. Her hair pulled back like she didn't want it to be noticed. She held out a folded piece of lined paper, creased 4 times, the edges worn soft. "I wanted to give you this," she said, barely above a whisper. Then, like it burned in her hand, she released it and walked away. JD looked down. No name on the front. Just faint pencil marks smudged from too much holding. He opened it slowly. The handwriting was uneven, the kind that starts over when the writer's hand shakes. "Dear Senator Vance, my dad stopped drinking the day after your interview. We watched it together. At first he laughed at what you said. Then he stopped laughing. And then he just stopped. He's been sober ever since. I don't know if it'll last, but we have dinner now. And he listens when I talk. I just thought someone should tell you that. Thank you." JD stood there in the empty hallway, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. No staff, no cameras, no press clipping to post later. Just this moment. He folded the letter back up, slow and careful this time, like it was something sacred. Then he reached for his wallet, the old one, leather worn thin at the edges, and slid the note inside, behind a faded picture of his grandmother. A bell rang in the distance. Kids poured out of classrooms, already forgetting the assembly, already onto math tests and lunch trays and Friday plans. But he stayed there, still as stone, one hand over his heart like it was holding something alive. Some victories don't go viral, some moments don't trend. But some letters, they stay. The auditorium was quiet, not the polite kind of quiet, but the kind where stillness presses against the walls, where even breathing feels like disruption. JD stood center stage, not behind a podium, just a man in worn boots on polished hardwood, facing rows of folding chairs filled with students, teachers, and tired parents still wearing steel-toe boots from work. There was no teleprompter, no producer in his earpiece, no cue for applause. Just him and the truth. His speech hadn't been about politics, not really. It was about things heavier than sound bites. What it costs to raise your voice when your whole life you've been told to keep your head down. What it means to come from nowhere and still believe you deserve a seat at the table. He talked about his grandmother's grit, the way shame burrows into families like mold, and how dignity isn't granted. It's taken back. And now, as the final minutes arrived, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't pause for effect. He just spoke. "They built a trap," he said, his voice steady, "and called it television. They lined it with applause signs and makeup lights, taught us how to smile while bleeding, how to nod while being erased." He took one slow step forward, not toward the audience, but toward the edge of something unseen. They didn't ask questions to understand. They asked to perform. They turned people into props and truth into a punchline. His eyes scanned the room. Some students leaned in. A few teachers lowered their heads. A janitor stood in the back, arms folded, not blinking. JD inhaled once. Then came the last line. "I brought the truth," he said, "and truth doesn't flinch." No drum roll, no music swell, just silence. Thick, reverent silence. Then from the far corner, a single clap. Then another. Then a wave, not of noise but recognition. The kind that doesn't need to shout because it knows it was seen. There were no standing ovations, just something quieter, deeper. A father pulling his son a little closer. A girl wiping the corner of her eye before anyone noticed. JD didn't wait for a spotlight to fade. He didn't bask. He stepped down, folded his notes, and walked into the aisle, where the real work waits. And behind him in the lingering hush, the line stayed, like spine, like truth. This story isn't just about a man confronting a media figure. It's about reclaiming the right to be heard without apology. JD's journey reminds us that dignity isn't reserved for the polished or privileged. It belongs to the ones who endure, who speak plainly, who carry both pain and pride in the same breath. He didn't aim to impress. He aimed to be real. And in a world built on performance, real is revolutionary. What touched me most was not the viral moment, but the quiet aftermath. A folded letter, a brother reapplying to school, a steelworker who no longer felt ashamed. Those moments matter more than a million views. They're proof that truth, when spoken from the gut, has a spine, and it stays. Now I'm wondering, have you ever seen someone speak a truth so raw, it stayed with you long after the noise ended? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories. JD,